Look at Pennsylvania from space at night, and you'll see a state split in half. The east glows, Philadelphia, its suburbs, a web of light stretching toward New York and Baltimore. The west is dark. Pittsburgh sits there like a fading ember, surrounded by emptiness that spreads across Appalachian hills and valleys. Most people assume the mountains explain this. The Appalachians run through the middle of the state like a spine, and mountains have always been barriers to settlement. It makes sense, but here is what that explanation misses entirely. Pittsburgh wasn't always dark. In the 1940s, this city produced 20% of the world's steel. Industrial smoke was so thick that streetlights stayed on at midday. The Homestead Works alone employed 15,000 people. Western Pennsylvania was not empty, it was indispensable. So the question is not why Western Pennsylvania never developed. The real question is far more interesting. Why did a region that once dominated global industry become one of the emptiest parts of the eastern United States? And if you enjoy videos like this, feel free to subscribe. To understand what happened to Western Pennsylvania, you first have to understand what happened to Eastern Pennsylvania. And that story begins almost a century before Pittsburgh even existed. Philadelphia was founded in 1682 at the confluence of two rivers with direct access to the Atlantic Ocean. From the very beginning, it had everything a colonial city needed. Ships could sail straight from the Delaware River to the Caribbean, to England, to anywhere in the Atlantic world. By the 1770s, Philadelphia had grown into the third most important business center in the entire British Empire. It had 30,000 people, Caribbean trade routes, shipbuilding wealth, and a network of merchants who controlled commerce across the colonies. Meanwhile, Western Pennsylvania did not even have a permanent British settlement until 1759. The French controlled Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio River, the future site of Pittsburgh, until 1758. When British forces finally captured the position and renamed it Fort Pitt, the entire region was still wilderness. There were no roads, no towns, no farms, just forest and mountains, and the faint possibility of something more. That is an 80-year gap. In early America, a head start was not just an advantage, it was a compounding engine. Capital attracted more capital, infrastructure attracted settlers, networks attracted trade. Every year that Philadelphia grew, it pulled further ahead. Every year that Western Pennsylvania remained wilderness, the gap widened. Think about what that means in practical terms. By the time Pittsburgh had its first real buildings, Philadelphia had already produced Benjamin Franklin, hosted the Continental Congress, and served as the capital of the United States. By the time Western Pennsylvania had its first banks, Eastern Pennsylvania had generations of accumulated wealth and established trade relationships spanning the Atlantic world. By the time Pittsburgh finally became a real city, Eastern Pennsylvania had universities, hospitals, insurance companies, and connections to every major market on the Atlantic seaboard. The West had mountains, rivers, and ambition. But ambition alone does not build cities. You need the infrastructure that comes with time, and time was something Western Pennsylvania simply did not have. The wall they had to conquer. The Appalachians weren't just inconvenient, they were a fortress. The Allegheny front rises over 2,000 feet in places. Early travelers used crude paths that hugged valleys and required military escorts to protect against ambushes. A journey from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh could take weeks of exhausting, dangerous travel. For most of Pennsylvania's early history, the western third of the state might as well have been a different country. But Americans don't accept geographic destiny. If the mountains were in the way, they would move them, or at least move through them. In 1834, engineers completed one of the most audacious transportation projects of the era, the Allegheny Portage Railroad. This wasn't a normal railroad. It was a system of inclined planes that literally hauled canal boats over the mountains on rails. Boats would float along a canal, then be lifted onto railroad cars, dragged up one side of the mountain, and lowered down the other. It was slow, expensive, and complicated, but it worked. 20 years later, the Pennsylvania Railroad went further. In 1854, they completed a continuous track from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, including the Gallitzin Tunnel, 3,600 feet bored straight through solid rock. The journey that once took weeks could now be done in a day. The mountains had been conquered, and what came next would transform Western Pennsylvania from an afterthought into a world power. The Empire of Steel. Andrew Carnegie established the Edgar Thomson Steel Works in 1875 just outside Pittsburgh. Within a generation, the region had become the beating heart of American industry. By the 1940s, Pittsburgh's mills ran 24-hour shifts in blistering heat. Furnaces glowed so bright that workers' faces burned. The city produced so much steel, so constantly, that 20% of the world's supply came from this single region. Not 20% of America's steel, 20% of the world's. Industrial smoke hung so thick over the city that streetlights stayed on at noon. Rivers ran orange with industrial runoff. The air tasted like metal. The Homestead Works alone employed 15,000 people at its peak. Entire neighborhoods were built around single mills. Towns with names like Braddock, Duquesne, and McKeesport grew into densely packed working-class communities where generations of families followed each other into the plants. Western Pennsylvania hadn't just caught up to the East. In terms of raw industrial output, it had surpassed it. Pittsburgh was making the steel that built American skyscrapers, American bridges, American railroads. The region wasn't just successful, it was essential. But all of that power rested on a single foundation. And foundations can crack. The single point of failure. Steel required something specific, a global economy that needed exactly what Pittsburgh made at the price Pittsburgh charged. As long as that equation held, the region prospered. But the region had no backup plan, no diversified industries, no hedge against the world changing. When you looked at Western Pennsylvania's economy, you saw steel, coal, and the industries that supported them. That was it. Eastern Pennsylvania, by contrast, had never been a monoculture. Philadelphia had ports that connected it to global shipping. It had railroads that linked it to New York and Washington. It had finance, manufacturing, education, and services. The Lehigh Valley produced textiles, cement, and eventually became a logistics hub. When one sector struggled, others absorbed the shock. The East had built an economy with redundancy, not by design, but by accident of history and location. Pittsburgh had put everything on one number, and the wheel was about to stop spinning. The day the music died. The trigger came on October 6, 1977. U.S. Steel announced 4,500 layoffs in a single day. Workers who had spent their entire lives in the mills, men whose fathers and grandfathers had worked the same furnaces, were told not to come back. Then, 1,800 more in November 1979. Then the worst news of all. In 1980, U.S. Steel posted a $239 million quarterly loss, the largest in American corporate history at that point. The collapse accelerated. Between 1981 and 1983, 150,000 steelworkers lost their jobs across the region. Regional unemployment hit 17%. Towns that had been built around mills found themselves with nothing. No other employers, no other industries, no plan for what comes next. Braddock, once home to 20,000 people, began emptying out. McKeesport lost half its population. Property values collapsed so fast that some homeowners simply walked away, leaving behind houses that would never sell. Schools closed for lack of students. Churches that had served steel families for generations locked their doors. Bars where men had gathered after shifts went dark. Main streets that had bustled with commerce became rows of shuttered storefronts. The psychological damage was just as severe as the economic damage. These were communities where a man's identity was tied to his work. You were a steel worker. Your father was a steel worker. Your sons would be steel workers. When the mills closed, people did not just lose jobs, they lost the future they had been promised. The Homestead Works, 15,000 employees, the symbol of American industrial might, shut down permanently in 1986. The furnaces went cold. The buildings stood empty. Today, that site is a shopping center called the Waterfront. Visitors can eat at chain restaurants and shop at big box stores on the same ground where workers once poured molten steel. A few smokestacks have been preserved as monuments, but most people walking past do not know what they represent. The Empire of Steel had lasted about a century. And when it fell, it took an entire region with it. Here's what makes the Pennsylvania story so painful. While Western Pennsylvania was collapsing, Eastern Pennsylvania was building something different. Not dramatically, not spectacularly, just steadily sector by sector, decade by decade. The Philadelphia suburbs attracted logistics and warehousing, companies that wanted proximity to the Interstate 95 corridor, the main artery connecting New York and Washington. Every truck that needed to reach the Northeast passed through this region. Every distribution center that wanted to serve 100 million people within a day's drive set up here. Healthcare systems expanded to serve an aging population and the thousands of medical professionals who trained at Penn, Temple, and Jefferson. The Lehigh Valley transformed from a declining industrial zone into one of the largest distribution hubs in the country. Amazon, FedEx, and dozens of other companies built massive warehouses in the corridor between Allentown and Easton. Professional services grew around Philadelphia's universities and financial institutions. Each sector fed the others. None of these industries were as dramatic as steel. There were no furnaces glowing in the night, no 15,000-person workforces at single plants. But that was exactly the point. They didn't need to be dramatic. They just needed to be diverse. When one sector struggled, others kept growing. When a warehouse closed, healthcare was hiring. When manufacturing declined, logistics expanded. Eastern Pennsylvania didn't have any single industry that could collapse and take everything down with it. It was built for survival, resilience, instead of raw power. The wound that won't heal. The consequences of the steel collapse are still cascading through Western Pennsylvania today, not as a single catastrophe, but as a slow bleed that never stops. Between 2020 and 2023, Forest County in the western part of the state lost 7% of its population. Meanwhile, Pike County in the east gained 5%. Rural Pennsylvania counties are projected to decline another 6% by 2050. The population drain that started with the steel mills has never stopped. It has just slowed down to a pace that makes it harder to notice. One family leaves, then another. Then the school consolidates with the next town over. Then the grocery store closes. A Mercer County official put it bluntly, population is the answer to about 95% of these rural communities' problems. Less people means less school funding, crumbling infrastructure, and less political representation. When you lose people, you lose tax base. When you lose tax base, you cannot maintain roads or keep the library open. When the roads crumble and the library closes, more people leave. It is a downward spiral that feeds on itself, and nobody has figured out how to stop it. In some central Appalachian counties, over 1/3 of the working-age population now has a documented disability. That is not just a marker of dangerous industrial jobs from decades past. The black lung, the crushed limbs, the bodies broken by years of labor. It is a marker of generational economic collapse. It is the signature of communities where the young and healthy left for opportunities elsewhere, and only those who could not leave remained. The mills closed 40 years ago, but Western Pennsylvania is still paying the price. The wound opened in 1977, and it never healed. Signs of life, or another false hope. There is one piece of this story that is not finished yet, and depending on who you ask, it is either a sign of renewal or another setup for disappointment. Carnegie Mellon University is one of the world's leading programs in robotics and artificial intelligence. Researchers there are building the machines that will power the next century of industry. The university has spun off companies, attracted venture capital, and turned neighborhoods that were once declining into hubs of young tech workers. UPMC, the healthcare system that grew out of the old University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, has become one of the largest employers in the state. There is a new generation moving into Pittsburgh, young professionals who see opportunity in cheap housing and urban renewal. They are buying homes in neighborhoods their grandparents would recognize, renovating row houses, and opening coffee shops and breweries in buildings that used to be something else entirely. For the first time in decades, some parts of the city are actually growing. Underneath the hills of western Pennsylvania lies the Marcellus Shale, one of the largest natural gas deposits in the entire country. Companies are drilling wells across the region, building pipelines that crisscross the landscape, and paying royalties to landowners who never expected to strike it rich. The gas boom has brought money to rural communities that desperately needed it. But here's the question that hangs over all of it. natural gas requires far fewer workers than coal or steel ever did. A drilling operation might employ a few dozen people at its peak, not a few thousand. The money flows to landowners and corporations, not to workers on a factory floor. And every boom-bust industry in western Pennsylvania's history has eventually gone bust, from lumber to coal to steel. Pittsburgh has seen false dawns before. The region has been promised renewal more than once. The question is not whether Pittsburgh can attract investment or whether tech companies will build campuses there. The real question is whether anyone is building the backup plan this time, whether someone has learned the lesson of what happens when you put everything on one number. Two halves, one state. Pennsylvania's divide isn't really about mountains. The Appalachians were conquered, tunneled through, bridged over, blasted apart. The barrier that seemed impossible in 1750 was irrelevant by 1900. Geography created a delay, but it didn't create destiny. What created destiny was economic structure. Eastern Pennsylvania, diversified by accident of history and proximity, sitting on trade routes between New York and Washington, connected to ports and railroads and the flow of capital. Western Pennsylvania specialized by choice, building everything around steel because steel was what the world needed. One half built an economy with redundancy, the other half built an economy with power. When the world changed, one half absorbed the shock, the other half shattered. Look at Pennsylvania from space tonight, and you'll still see that divide. The East glows with the lights of millions of people. The West fades into darkness, punctuated by the ember of Pittsburgh and little else. It's not because of the land. The land was conquered long ago. It's because of the choices that were made on it and the consequences that followed. Geography drew a line through Pennsylvania. History widened it. Economics turned it into a wall. And today, that wall is still standing, as visible from space as it was the day the first mill closed.